If I told you that 99% of all companies are in one of these 8 industries, you'd probably guess that I was about to say tech, pharma, retail, something like that. But no, I'm actually going to say agriculture, mining, manufacturing, construction, hospitality, and other services. And you might be wondering, why does it matter? After all, we talk about tech companies, consumer companies, banks, and so on all the time. Well, it turns out that while we do this all the time, we shouldn't. At least that is the argument made by the author of an HBR article called Stop Classifying Companies by Industry. So let me tell you about it. The author says that over the past few decades, 3 things have happened. First, advances in computing power have made it possible for companies to collect and analyze massive amounts of data about their customers. Second, improvements in data collection have given us really precise information about what those customers want. And third, globalization has led to increased competition within each industry. The result is that companies within the same industry are becoming more and more alike, which means that classifying them by industry is just not that useful anymore. To illustrate this point, he uses the example of Netflix. If you were to classify Netflix with traditional industry classifications, you would put them in the entertainment industry. But if you look at what Netflix actually does, they're really just a data company. They collect data about what movies and shows you watch, and then use that data to recommend other stuff you might like. In fact, if you look at job postings from companies like Netflix, Amazon, and Google, meanwhile, traditional media companies like Disney and Viacom are trying to figure out how to deal with the disruption that Netflix has caused. So clearly, the old industry classification doesn't really apply here. Well, one thing you could do is classify companies based on what they do. For instance, we could call Netflix and Amazon data companies, and Disney and Viacom traditional media companies. But the author argues that this approach also has problems. For instance, it leaves out the many ways that companies are similar. Both Netflix and Disney produce content. Both Amazon and Google provide cloud services. And both Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure provide cloud services. So what we really need is a new way to classify companies that takes into account both their similarities and their differences. In his article, the author proposes a framework that's based on 2 dimensions. The first dimension is how intensely competitive an industry is. On one end, you have industries like airlines and banking, where there are lots of competitors. And on the other end, you have industries like pharmaceuticals and software, where there are relatively few competitors. The second dimension is how much the industry has been disrupted by digital technologies. On one end, you have industries like retail and hospitality, where things have been completely opaque. And on the other end, you have industries like energy and mining, which have been largely unaffected. When you plot companies on this 2x2 grid, you get something that looks like this. Now, the author doesn't propose this as the perfect solution. Instead, he wants to open up the conversation. The bottom line is that when we're trying to understand companies, we shouldn't start out by asking what industry they're in. It just doesn't tell us that much anymore. Instead, we should ask what companies do, how they do it, and how those activities are likely to change in the future. I really liked this article because it forced me to rethink something that I take for granted all the time, the way that we talk about and classify companies. Of course, it is not the first time that people have talked about how the way that we categorize the world around us influences the way that we think. The late professor of cognitive science at UMichigan, George Lakoff, talks about this in his book, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. He argues that our everyday language is full of basic categories like color, shape, time, and space. But these categories aren't as basic as we think. Instead, they reflect the way that our brains process the information that we experience, and this can lead to some really interesting insights. For instance, Lakoff argues that the way that we categorize colors tells us something about the way that we think about time. You notice that speakers of different languages categorize colors differently. Some languages had separate words for light blue and dark blue, while others didn't. And and this turned out to be related to whether or not the speakers of those languages thought about time in a linear way, or a cyclical way. Speakers of languages with separate words for light blue and dark blue tended to think about time linearly. That is, they thought of it as a straight line that went from past through present to future. Meanwhile, speakers of languages without separate words for light blue and dark blue tended to think of time as cyclical. That is, they thought of it as a circle that went from past through present back to the future again. Now, obviously, this is a pretty obscure example, but the more you think about it, the more you realize that the way that we categorize the world really does influence the way that we think about it. So, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, definitely check out Lakof's book. If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy the episode on motivated reasoning, which is about how our beliefs can get in the way of our thinking. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.